Hey everyone, welcome to the first PowerPoint of Module 4. And this is Module 8.1. We're going to start talking about the anatomy of the nervous system here. We already talked a little bit about some of the structure and function of neurons and some of the basic anatomical structures and functions of some of the building blocks of the nervous system, but now we're going to dive deep into it. With this being the first PowerPoint of this new unit, I want to let you guys know that this one's just going to work a little bit differently than the previous units. So each of the first PowerPoints of the next three modules, modules 8, 9, and 10, are going to be kind of an overview of everything we're talking about here. And then the subsequent modules, so whether they be 8.21, 8.22, or 8.3, 9.21, you get the picture. Those are going to dive deeper into what we're talking about. So as I said, each of the first PowerPoint in the system, so module 8.1, module 9.1, and module 10.1 are going to cover the general topic in its entirety. And then each of the subsequent PowerPoint modules are going to go into greater detail of what we're talking about. So we're going to start out here with talking about embryonic development. So the brain and all of the nervous tissue forms the ectoderm, and during embryonic development, a thin flat layer of ectoderm begins to thicken to form what we call the neuroplate, which then invaginates to form the neural groove, also called the neurofolds. Eventually, the two sides of the neural groove touch, and they form an internal passageway called the neurocell. And the structure is now called the neurotube at that point. The neural tube will go on to form the CNS, while the neural crest, which is located near the tube, will develop into the PNS. So in primary vesicles, the anterior end of the neural tube begins to enlarge, forming three prominent divisions called the primary brain vesicles. And these are the proencephalon, or the forebrain, the mesencephalon, or the midbrain, or the rhombencephalon, or the hindbrain. And the posterior end of the neural tube will become the spinal cord. In secondary vesicles, by about week 5 of development, the primary brain vesicles have changed position, and the prosencephalon and the rhombencephalon have further subdivided to form what we consider to be the secondary brain vesicles. And the mesencephalon does not change significantly during that development, but as development continues, the cerebrum enlarges to the point where it covers the other portions of the brain. So the brain contains about 97% of the body's neural tissue, and a typical adult brain weighs about 3 pounds, has a volume of about 1,200 milliliters. Brain size varies considerably among individuals. On an average, the brains of males are about 10% larger than that of females, but that's due to differences in body size. I want to make it known that no correlation, as we know of, exists between brain size and intelligence. But individuals with the smallest brains and largest brains are essentially functionally normal. So getting started with the cerebrum here, it accounts for about 80% of the brain's mass. A little bit about the anatomy of the cerebrum. The cerebrum functions in conscious thought and memory storage, processing, sensory processing, the regulation of skeletal muscle contractions. So the surface of the cerebrum is highly folded and covered with a superficial layer of gray matter called the cerebral cortex. We can start talking about the lobes of the cerebral cortex here. And some of the ancillary structures. So fissures, or what we consider to be deep grooves. The sulcus, or the sulci, are shallow, deep depressions that separate the folds of the wrinkles. And the gyrus, or the gyri, are folds or wrinkles that increase the surface area. And cerebrum, like I said, is divided into large cerebral hemispheres by that longitudinal fissure. And each cerebral hemisphere is further divided into the lobes that I previously mentioned. And there are 5 lobes: the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, the temporal, and the insula lobes. The central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The wrinkle immediately in front of the central sulcus is called the precentral gyrus, while the wrinkle immediately behind the central sulcus is called the postcentral gyrus. The lateral sulcus separates the frontal and the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe, and white matter of the corpus callosum provides the major pathway for communication between the two hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. So a little bit about the cerebrum in more detail. So as mentioned earlier, the cerebrum functions in conscious thought, memory, storage, processing, sensory processing, and the regulation of skeletal muscle contractions. The cerebral cortex is the gray matter of the cerebrum and is responsible for all qualities associated with consciousness. Each hemisphere is concerned with sensory and motor functions of the opposite sides of the body, and that's what we call contralateral. Even though symmetrical in structure, the two hemispheres are not quite equal in function, and instead there are lateralizations or specializations in their cortical function. So in the right brain, that analyzes sensory information and relates the body to sensory environments. Interpretive centers in this hemisphere enable you to identify familiar objects by touch, sight, smell, taste, or feel. In right brain, individuals are often more artistic, musically inclined, or attuned to their emotions. The left brain, on the other hand, possesses general interpretive and speech centers and important for language-based skills. So it's also important in reading, writing, speaking, math, and logic. The cerebral cortex was analyzed microscopically and divided into 52 regions called the Brodmann's regions, and that's what you see posted on the slide here. And the cerebral cortex contains three functional areas that are composed of interneurons, which we'll get into shortly, which are the motor areas, which control voluntary motor functions, the sensory areas, which provide conscious awareness of sensations, and the association areas, which integrate all sensory and motor information. And keep in mind that no functional area acts alone, and conscious behavior involves the entire cerebral cortex in one way or the other. So, speaking more about the motor areas of the cerebral cortex, the primary motor cortex, or area 4, is located within the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. Processes large neurons called pyramidal cells, and allows conscious control of skilled voluntary movements of skeletal muscles. And the motor areas of the precentral gyrus have been spatially mapped. And that's something that we call somopathy. So in the premotor cortex, which is located anterior to the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe, this is the region that controls learned motor skills that are repeated or patterned, such as playing an instrument or typing. And some people say this is called muscle memory. This also coordinates the movements of muscles simultaneously and or sequentially by by sending active impulses to the primary motor cortex. And the Broca's area, it is also known as the speech center, is located anterior to the lower part of the premotor cortex. This is involved in direct motor speech, including thinking about or planning to speak, and this is present in only one of the hemispheres, and it's typically the left hemisphere. In the frontal eye field, which is located anterior to the premotor cortex and superior to the Broca's, controls the voluntary movement of the eye and generally has no role in the interpretation of visual stimuli. Moving into the sensory areas of the cerebral cortex, you have the somatosensory cortex, which is located within the parietal lobe of the cerebrum. Cortex located in the posterior gyrus. Neurons receive touch information, for example, temperature, pressure, vibration, pain, etc., from the somatosensory receptors of the skin and from proprioceptors in the skeletal muscle. And this endows special discrimination, or rather allows you to interpret what the body region is being stimulated. In the somatosensory association area, which lies posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex, it integrates and analyzes the somatic sensory inputs from the primary somatosensory cortex and memories of previous experience to produce an understanding about what's being felt. This also allows you to recognize cold, flat, round things in your pocket, such as like a quarter. In the visual cortex, which is located within the occipital lobe of the cerebrum, we have the primary visual cortex, which receives light information from the retina of the eye, such as color, form, texture, and movement. We also have the visual association areas, which integrate and analyze the visual information coming from the primary visual cortex and past experience to interpret what image is being seen. For example, a face, flower, car, or a stop sign. In the auditory complex, which is located within the temporal lobes, we have the primary auditory cortex, which receives sound information from the ear, such as pitch, rhythm, and volume, and then the auditory association area, which integrates and analyzes that information from the primary auditory context and relates that, again, to past experience to interpret what that sound or stimulus means. There are other sensory areas, such as the olfactory cortex, which is located in the medial aspect of the temporal lobe, responsible for conscious perception of odors and smells, the gustatory complex, which is located in the insula and portions of the frontal lobe and involved in the conscious perception of taste, and the visceral sensory cortex, which is located in the insula and involved in the conscious perception of visceral sensations, such as an upset stomach, a full bladder, or the urge to defecate, things like that. Moving into the interpretive areas of the cerebrum, we have the prefrontal cortex, which is also called the anterior association area. And this is involved with intellect, complex learning abilities, recall, and personality. This is necessary for abstract ideas, judgment, reasoning, planning, concern for others, and conscience. Tumors in this area frequently lead to personality disorders. We also have the general interpretive areas, so these are also called the posterior association areas. And these encompass part of the temporal, occipital, and parietal lobes of one hemisphere, which is again usually the left. And these seamlessly integrate sensory and motor information with emotions. It also plays a role in recognizing patterns in faces, localizing us in our surroundings, and binding different sensory inputs into a coherent whole value to get a full picture of what we're looking at. This also contains the Wernicke's area, which is involved in understanding written and spoken language and sounding out unfamiliar words. So a little bit about the white matter of the cerebrum. The white matter of the cerebrum is located deep to the gray matter and is composed of primarily myelinated fibers, bundles into tracts. This provides communication between the different cortical areas of the cerebral cortex and between the cerebral cortex and the lower CNS centers. So a little bit about damage to the cerebral cortex here. You can see all of the things on the slide that can be associated with some of the damages, and I'll let you go ahead and read that. Moving on, we can talk a little bit about the basal nuclei, which are the islands of gray matter located deep within the white matter of the cerebrum. And don't worry, we'll talk a little bit more about what specifically gray matter and white matter are a little bit later on. So the function of the islands of gray matter is to subconsciously control large autonomic skeletal muscle contractions, such as arm swinging when walking, and to play a role in maintaining attention and to produce dopamine. So disorders of the basal nuclei usually result in too much or too little movements, kind of like what you see in Huntington's disease, which can be too much, or Parkinson's disease, which is too little. Within that, we also have some limbic system involvement, so which is not an isolated part of the brain, but actually spans large areas in several parts, particularly around the medial aspects of the cerebral hemispheres. Keep in mind, the limbic system is our emotional brain. So the amygdala recognizes angry and fearful facial expressions, assesses danger, and elicits fear responses, which are associated with the fight or flight syndrome. And the cingulated gyrus plays a role in expressing our emotions through gestures and resolving mental conflicts when frustrated. The limbic system also holds the hippocampus region, which, along with the amygdala, plays a role in formation of memories. So the diencephalon serves as the structural and functional link between the cerebral hemispheres and the rest of the central nervous system. The diencephalon is completely covered by the cerebrum and is not visible by external examination, so it needs to be sliced open to be able to be seen. And it is further subdivided into the thalamus, which forms the superior lateral walls of the third ventricle. That's composed of masses of gray matter held together by the midline of a commissary fibers known as intermediate masses that contain important relay and processing sensors for sensory information, sometimes called the gatekeeper relay stations. It contains many nuclei, each projecting fibers and receiving fibers from a specific region of the cerebral cortex. It also contains the hypothalamus, which forms the inferior lateral walls of the third ventricle, and the walls of the hypothalamus meet and extend to form the infundibulum, from which the pituitary gland is suspended, and that serves as the main visceral control center. It's also has several homeostatic roles, which include the autonomic control center, influences blood pressure, heart rate, GI motility, respiration rate, depth, pupil size, things like that. It's also the center for emotional responsive behavior. It controls body temperature and regulations and initiates sweating and shivering, regulates food intake, regulates water balance to thirst mechanisms, has a role in sleep, wake cycle regulation, and releases hormones that control the secretions of the anterior pituitary gland. Lastly, it also encompasses the epithalamus, which forms the roof of the third ventricle. It contains an extensive area of the carotid process, which is a posterior mass of commissure fibers, and the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin and responsible for regulating the sleep and wake cycles. Talk a little bit about the brainstem, which are only portions of the brainstem are visible underneath the cerebrum. And though small, this is an extremely important part of the brain as the nerve connections of the motor and sensory system from the main part of the brain to the rest of the body pass through the brainstem. The brainstem can be further subdivided into the midbrain, which contains nuclei that process visual and auditory information and control reflexes that are triggered by these stimuli. It also contains centers to help maintain consciousness. And among those include the corpora quadrantum, which is made up of two nuclei on each side, the superior coculi, which are visual reflexes and head-eye coordination, the inferior coculi, which are auditory and startle reflexes, the subcutaneous nigra, which contains copious amounts of melanin, which is the precursor to dopamine and regulates the activity of the basal nuclei in the brain. It also has been linked to some parts of Parkinson's disease. You have the red nucleus, which contains large amounts of hemoglobin and iron, and issues subconscious muscle commands that affect upper limb portions and background muscle tone. And you also have the cerebral aqueduct, which allows for CSF or cerebrospinal fluid to flow to the third ventricle down to the fourth ventricle. Within that, we also have the pons, which is located beneath the midbrain and above the medulla oblongata, and that possesses projection fibers between the higher and lower brain centers and also between the pons and the cerebellum. This possesses nuclei that function in somatic and visceral motor control. Some of the pons nuclei are respiratory centers that help maintain the normal rhythm of breathing. We also have the medulla oblongata, which relays sensory information to other portions of the brainstem and to the thalamus. The medulla also contains major centers for regulating autonomic functions like those of the hypothalamus. So, like the hypothalamus can help to control the force and rate of heart contractions, can help regulate blood pressure by regulating the smooth muscles of blood vessels, helps to regulate the rate and depth of breathing, and also helps to regulate visceral reflexes such as vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. Lastly, we can talk about reticular formation here, and it extends through the central core of the medulla oblongata, the pons in the midbrain, and this helps to maintain cerebral cortical awareness by the reticular activating system. And this filters out repetitive or weak stimuli and helps to regulate skeletal and visceral muscle activity. The cerebellum accounts for about 11% of the brain's mass. The cerebellum functions in coordination and modulation of motor commands from the cerebral cortex and maintaining balance and equilibrium. Cerebellum is also partially hidden by the cerebral hemispheres and is the second largest structure of the brain. It's separated from the cerebrum by something we call transverse fissures. It also possesses fold-like wrinkles called folia and is divided into two hemispheres and further subdivided into lobes. The anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. And the two cerebral hemispheres, or cerebellar hemispheres, are separated by vermins, while the anterior and posterior lobes are separated by the primary fissure. The white matter of the cerebellum is called the arbor vitae and is surrounded by a gray matter called cerebellar cortex. So the adult spinal cord measures approximately 45 centimeters or about 18 inches in length, and it has a maximum width of roughly about 14 millimeters or about a half an inch. Spinal cord is located within the vertebral foramen, also known as vertebral canal. Talking a little bit about the anatomy of the spinal cord. So the cervical enlargement supplies nerves to the shoulder and the upper limbs. The lumbar enlargement provides innervation to the structures of the pelvic and the lower limbs. The conus medullaris is the tapered conical portion of the spinal cord that's inferior to the lumbar enlargement. And because the adult spinal cord extends at the level of the first to the second lumbar vertebrae, the dorsal and ventral roots of the spinal segments L2 and S5 extend inferiorly. And when seen in gross dissections, the filum terminale and the long ventral and dorsal roots resemble a horse's tail. Hence, this complex is called the cauda equina. So the filum terminale is a slender strand of fibrous tissue which extends from the tip of the conus medullaris to the second sacral vertebrae. It provides longitudinal support to the spinal cord and is a component of the coccygeal ligament. So the posterior medium sulcus is a shallow longitudinal groove on the posterior or the dorsal surface of the spinal cord, and the anterior medium fissure is a deep groove on the anterior or the ventral surface. Finally, the central canal is a longitudinal pathway that extends the length of the spinal cord and contains the CSF. The spinal cord contains gray matter and white matter. So gray matter, which is dominated by the cell bodies of neurons, neuroglia, and unmyelinated axons, surrounds the narrow central canal and forms a butterfly shape. And the gray matter can be organized into structural and functional areas. So part of the structural organization, the projections of gray matter towards the outer surface of the spinal cord are called horns. And so you have the posterior gray horn, which contains the somatic and visceral sensory nuclei, the lateral gray horn, which is located only in the thoracic and lumbar segments, which contains visceral and motor nuclei, and the anterior great horn, which also contains somatic motor nuclei. Looking at the functional organization, the cell bodies of the neurons and the gray matter of the spinal cord are organized into functional groups called nuclei. So sensory nuclei receive and relay sensory information from the receptor bodies of the CNS, and motor nuclei issue motor commands to the peripheral effectors. The superficial white matter contains large numbers of myelinated and unmyelinated axons. Like gray matter, white matter is also divided into functional and structural areas. So part of the structural organization, the structural components of white matter are divided into columns, and the posterior white column lies between the posterior gray horns and the posterior median sulcus. The lateral white column includes the white matter on either side of the spinal cord between the anterior and posterior columns, and the anterior white column lies between the anterior gray horns and the anterior median fissure. Part of the functional organization, keep in mind the functional component of the white matter is divided into tracts. So you have the ascending tract, which carries sensory information towards the brain, and the descending tract, which carries motor information from the brain to the spinal cord. So the meninges of the spinal cord, they are delicate neurotissues that must be protected from shock, including damaging contact with surrounding bony walls of the vertebral canal. And the spinal meninges are a series of specialized membranes that surround the spinal cord and provide the necessary physical stability in that shock absorption. So the spinal meninges consist of three layers. The tough fibrous dura mater are the outermost coverings of the spinal cord and contains dense collagen fibers that are oriented along the longitudinal axis of the cord. Between the dura mater and the walls of the ventral canal lies the epidural space, which is a region that contains areolar or connective tissue, blood vessels, and a protective padding of adipose tissue. So a narrow subdural space separates the dura mater from the arachnoid matter. The arachnoid matter is the middle meningeal layer and includes a simple squamous epithelium called the arachnoid membrane and the subarachnoid space that extends between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater. The pia mater consists of a meshwork of elastic and collagen fibers that's firmly bound to the underlying neural tissue. So the subarachnoid space contains the arachnoid trabeculae, which is a network of collagen and elastic fiber which attaches to the arachnoid matter to the pia mater, and is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which acts as a shock absorber and a diffusion medium for dissolved gases, nutrients, chemical messengers, and waste products. The spinal meninges accompany the dorsal and ventral roots as they pass through the intervertebral forma, and the meningeal membranes are continuous with the connective tissues that surround the spinal nerves and their peripheral branches. In adults, the CSF can be safely withdrawn from a procedure known as a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap, in which a needle is inserted into the subarachnoid space in the lumbar region inferior to the tip of the conus medullaris. So the brain possesses four fluid-filled chambers called ventricles. And these ventricles contain CSF, as I already told you, cerebrospinal fluid. And CSF is formed by the carotid process, or plexus, which is an intricate network of capillaries and absorbed by the arachnoid trabeculae. The ventricles are lined with ependymal cells, which whip their cilia to circulate the CSF, and there are four ventricles. There are two lateral ventricles, the right and left, each within one of the cerebral hemispheres. The third ventricle is located in the diencephalon, and the fourth ventricle begins in the metaencephalon and extends into the superior portion of the medulla oblongata. It then narrows and is continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. Each lateral ventricle communicates with the third ventricle via an interventricular foramen called the foramen of Monro. The two lateral ventricles are separated from each other by a partition known as the septum pediculum. And the third ventricle communicates with the fourth ventricle via the cerebral aqueduct. And this is a slender canal that passes through the midbrain. Let's talk more about the blood-brain barrier, but just as an overview, the blood-brain barrier of the brain helps to maintain a stable environment for the central nervous system and has a distinct composition that is different from blood plasma. Most notably, there are fewer plasma proteins within the blood-brain barrier, and has a selectively permeable membrane in the nutrients it contains, the waste and toxins, and it's ineffective against fats and gases. So those can travel easily through the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is also absent in some regions of the body, for example, in the vomiting center, so that the body can monitor the composition, and if, for example, you were to take something toxic, could initiate the vomiting reflex. So connective tissue sheets are also shown here, where you can see the epineurium, which surrounds each nerve, and the peri, which surrounds a vascular bundle of nerves, and the endo, which surrounds the axon itself. So the epi is the outer, and the endo is deep within. Talk a little bit more about the cranial nerves here. So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Each pair of nerves is classified as either sensory, containing sensory neurons only, motor, containing motor neurons only, or mixed, containing both sensory and motor neurons. And for each of the 12 cranial nerves, to be sure, make sure that you can name, number, and describe the function, or identify if it's sensory, motor, or mixed, or name a disorder if there's one associated with it. This kind of helps to highlight what you need to know about cranial nerves in general. There are also spinal nerves. So spinal nerves are designed similar to the design of a muscle. The spinal nerve is composed of bundles called fascicles, and each fascicle is composed of numerous nerve cells called neurons. The entire nerve is surrounded in a thin layer of connective tissue called the epineurium, which is the outer layer, and it's wrapped in a perineurium, which is the middle layer, and each neuron is surrounded by a connective tissue called the endoneurium, or the inner layer. Each spinal nerve branches to form rami, and each of these rami carry visceral motor fibers of the ANS. Spinal nerves of the thoracic and upper lumbar segments of the spinal cord carry the motor output of the sympathetic division that is responsible for the fight or flight response. So you have the dorsal ramus, which innervates the muscles, joints, and skin of the back, the ventral ramus, which innervates the structures in the lateral and anterior trunk as well as the limbs, and the communicating rami, which are present in the thoracic and superior lumbar sections of the spinal cord. These rami contain axons of the sympathetic neurons. The specific bilateral region of the skin surface monitored by a single pair of neurons is known as a dermatome. And each pair of spinal neurons services its own dermatome, but the boundaries of adjacent dermatomes overlap to a certain degree. Dermatomes are clinically important because of damage or infections of a spinal nerve or dorsal root ganglion produces a characteristic loss of sensation in the corresponding regions of the skin around that dermatome. There are also 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and all are mixed nerves. So a complex interwoven network of the ventral rami of the spinal nerves is called a plexus. The ventral rami form four major plexus. You have the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. So the cervical plexus consists of the ventral rami of the spinal nerves C1 through C5, and this is mostly cutaneous nerves that supply the skin, and a few innervate the muscles of the anterior neck. The phrenic nerve is also the single most important cervical nerve that innervates the diaphragm for breathing. The brachial plexus innervates the pectoral girdle and the upper limbs and continues from the ventral rami of the spinal nerves C4 through T1. The radial nerve is the largest branch of the brachial plexus and produces elbow extensions, forearm supination, wrist and finger extensions, and thumb abduction. The ulnar nerve produces wrist and finger flexion and adduction as well as abduction of the medial fingers. The median nerve pronates the foramen and flexes the wrist and the fingers and opposes the thumb. The suprascapular nerve innervates the supraspinatus and the infraspinatus muscles for movement of the shoulder. And the distribution of cutaneous nerves of the wrist and the hand is very important in clinical medicine. Nerve damage or injury in this region can be precisely located by carefully testing sensory functions of that hand. In the thoracic region, this does not form a plexus, and none of the intercostal nerves intertwine there. There are 12 pairs of intercostal nerves that give rise to many of the cutaneous branches to the chest and the torso area and innervate the external intercostal muscles for breathing. The lumbar plexus innervates the pelvic girdle and portions of the lower limb, and the lumbar plexus rises from the spinal nerves T12 through L4. The femoral nerve is the largest terminal nerve in this plexus and innervates the anterior muscles of the thigh, so the thigh flexors and the knee extensors, and branches to form the saphenous nerve on the medial thigh and the knee. The obturator nerve innervates the adductor muscles of the leg. In the sacral plexus arises from spinal nerves L4 through S4, and the largest branch of the sacral plexus is the sciatic nerve, which supplies the entire lower limb, except for the anterior medial thigh. The sciatic nerve is the thickest and longest nerve in the body and branches to form the tibial nerve, which are the flexors of the knee and the extensions of the ankle, the flexors of the toes, and the plantar surface of the foot. The fibular nerve, which is the biceps femoris muscle and the tibialis anterior muscle, and extensors of the toes, the surface of the leg, and the dorsal surface of the foot. And the pudendal nerve, which innervates the muscles of the perineum, the urogenial diaphragm, and the external anal and urethral sphincter muscles, also the skin of the genitalia. There are some imbalances that are associated with the nerves that are shown here. Chickenpox or shingles is a virus that can remain dormant within these nerves, and you may suffer from chickenpox as a child, and the virus can remain dormant and show up later as adult as shingles. Fainting or syncope is where you have a decrease in blood flow to the brain, and stroke is where you suffer from a lack of oxygen to the brain and the cells may die. There are various forms of meningitis or inflammation of the meninges, and spina bifida, which is an incomplete closing of the backbone and membranes around the spinal cord. Spina bifida is not as common because the recommendation for pregnant women or women planning to become pregnant is to increase their intake of folic acid. So as I said, keep in mind this was just a general overview of this topic, and the subsequent modules will dive further into these and give you some more detailed information on them.